If you would like to contact me, send me an email to monty_collier2000@yahoo.com. Welcome to the Presbyterian Research Center. My name is Monty Collier. In this video I will be discussing R.C. Sproul and casuistry. This is part 11. In the past few videos we compared R.C. Sproul's claim that men have free will and the power of self-determination with the teaching found in the Bible alone. We found out that he was lying. We also compared Sproul's teaching to that of Augustine. I selected a work of Augustine published toward the end of his life, specifically Enchiridion. We also compared Sproul's teaching to the teaching of Martin Luther, specifically Luther's remarks found in his 1525 work titled The Bondage of the Will. We again compared Sproul's teaching to that of John Calvin. Here, in that video, I made use of several editions of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, specifically the 1541 edition, as well as his final 1559 edition. In each case, we found Sproul's claim that men have the so-called free will power of self-determination to be false, contradicting the Bible, as well as Augustine, Luther, and Calvin. Of course, Sproul made this heretical claim in chapter 3 of his book titled Chosen by God. In this video, we will compare R.C. Sproul's teaching that men have the free will power of self-determination to the teaching of Jonathan Edwards. Sproul points to Edwards' book, The Freedom of the Will, suggesting to the reader that Edwards agreed with him. But does Jonathan Edwards teach Sproul's unbiblical claim? Let's find out. When we read Jonathan Edwards' book, The Freedom of the Will, we find Edwards telling us that God alone has the power of self-determination. Edwards teaches that God alone has free will. All of God's creatures, according to Edwards, are determined by God. None of them, in this metaphysical sense of speaking, have wills free from God's causation. Edwards maintains that God is the first cause of whatsoever comes to pass. He writes the following, and I quote, "God chooses by self-determining power." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 279. Jonathan Edwards describes God to be, quote, "the first being who is self-existent, independent, of perfect and absolute simplicity and immutability, and the first cause of all things." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 262. Edwards goes on to say, and I quote, "The following things belong to the sovereignty of God, that his will is supreme, underived, and independent on anything without himself, being in everything determined by his own counsel, self-determination, having no other rule but his own wisdom, his will not being subject to or restrained by the will of any other, and other wills being perfectly subject to his." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 265. The emphasis is mine. Next, let's see Jonathan Edwards contradict Sproul's obnoxious claim that men have the free will power of self-determination. Edwards tells us that Calvinism does not teach that men have wills free from God's absolute predestination, causation, and divine necessity, nor do men have powers of self-determination. Instead, and by contrast, Edwards tells us that it is the Pelagians, the Roman Catholics, and the Arminians who teach that men have the power of free will and self-determination in the metaphysical sense of speaking. Edwards writes the following, pay very close attention, I quote, "What has been said may be sufficient to show what is meant by liberty according to the common notions of mankind, and in the usual and primary acceptation of the word. But the word, as used by Arminians, Pelagians, and others, who oppose the Calvinists, has an entirely different signification. These several things belong to their notion of liberty. 1. That it consists in a self-determining power in the will, or a certain sovereignty the will has over itself and its own acts, whereby it determines its own volitions, so as not to be dependent in its determinations on any cause without itself, nor determined by anything prior to its own acts." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 33. The emphasis is Edwards. Jonathan Edwards rejected the notion that men have wills capable of self-determination throughout his book. In the subsequent quote, we see Edwards rejecting the teaching of Dr. Whitby, a popular Arminian of that day, who maintained that men have the power of self-determination. Edwards writes the following, and I quote, "The will necessarily follows this light or view of the understanding not only in some of its acts, but in every act of choosing and refusing, so that the will does not determine itself in any one of its own acts, but all its acts, every act of choice and refusal, depends on and is necessarily connected with some antecedent cause, which cause is not the will itself, nor any act of its own, nor anything pertaining to that faculty, but something belonging to another faculty, whose acts go before the will in all its acts, and govern and determine them every one. Therefore, the will is necessarily determined in every one of its acts, from a man's first existence, by a cause beside the will, and a cause that does not proceed from or depend upon any act of the will at all." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 90 through 91. In the following quote, Edwards points out that the idea of men determining their own acts is opposed to moral agency. He writes the following, and I quote, "And thus the Arminian notion of the freedom of the will, consisting in the soul's determining its own acts of will instead of being essential to moral agency, and to men's being the subjects of moral government, is utterly inconsistent with it. So that it is the Arminian scheme, and not the scheme of the Calvinists, that is utterly inconsistent with moral government, and with all use of laws, precepts, prohibitions, promises, or threatenings." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 182 that time. Here is another quotation from Edwards, informing us that Arminian metaphysics holds to the belief that the wills of men have the power of self-determination. He writes, and I quote, "One thing that is made very much a ground of argument and supposed demonstration by Arminians in defense of the forementioned principles concerning moral agency, virtue, vice, and so on, is their metaphysical notion of agency and action. They say, unless the soul has a self-determining power, it has not power of action. If its volitions be not caused by itself, but are excited and determined by some extrinsic cause, they cannot be the soul's own acts." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 224. Continuing his refutation of Arminianism, Jonathan Edwards explains that God determining all events and the choices of men is logically incompatible with the Arminian metaphysical notion that the wills of men are self-determining. If one is true, then the other is necessarily false. Since the Bible teaches that God determines all the choices of men, see Proverbs 16:1, Ephesians 1 through 11, for example, then Arminianism, with its view of man's self-determination concerning all his choices, is wrong. This is why Edwards writes the following, and I quote, "God himself is the giver or determining cause of the events sought, but if they depend on self-determination, then God is not the determining or disposing author of them." End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 253. So as demonstrated above, R.C. Sproul's position on predestination does not agree with that of Jonathan Edwards. As always, I do not recommend anyone to take my word for this. I invite the listener to obtain copies of the books mentioned and cited here. Read those books for yourself and make up your own mind. Test both books to Scripture alone to see which one is correct, if any. Compare the teachings of Sproul and Edwards to the Bible alone and see who is telling the truth. I close with a simple comparison of Edwards and Sproul. Jonathan Edwards says, and I quote, "What has been said may be sufficient to show what is meant by liberty according to the common notions of mankind and in the usual and primary acceptation of the word. But the word, as used by Arminians, Pelagians, and others who oppose the Calvinists, has an entirely different signification. These several things belong to their notion of liberty. 1. that it consists in a self-determining power in the will, or a certain sovereignty the will has over itself and its own acts, whereby it determines its own volitions so as not to be dependent in its determinations on any cause without itself, nor determined by anything prior to its own acts. End quote. The Freedom of the Will, page 33. The emphasis is Edwards. Compare that to Sproul, who wrote, and I quote, "At every point of choice we are free and self-determined," end quote. Chosen by God, chapter 3, page 59. Obviously, Sproul has the Arminian definition. God bless.